Trump is back, but should stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements be cheerful about his return to the Oval Office? So if that introduction sounded super familiar, it's because this would be the second of what will initially include 4 parts of my Trump 2.0 content mini-series. If you didn't catch the previous part loosely titled Regulatory yet, I'd suggest stopping this content right now and consuming that one first because it does have some valuable chronological elements. But for my regular audience that has already consumed the previous regulatory part of my Trump 2.0 content miniseries, unless you want a refresh of my second Trump presidential term general strategy considerations, you can save a minute or two by skipping ahead to the next chapter of this video. And by saying that, I promise to do my best to remember adding content chapters. But if I do forget, you'll easily be able to recognize the skippable repeat section because I'm wearing a different outfit. So this will certainly not sound like a hot take or anything, but the second Trump presidential term will undoubtedly offer a mixture of risk and reward, ushering in a new era of market volatility. As Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt recently pointed out, we once again have access to the most transparent and accessible president in American history. There has never been a president who communicates with the American people as openly and authentically as Donald Trump. But while I personally enjoy that operating model, it does create an economic environment that I recently described to an industry colleague as best suited for master sailors. And that's because the art of both the sailor and business person is to leave nothing to chance. But sailors are artists whose medium is the wind, and today's business people must be artists whose medium is correctly spotting Donald Trump's subtle hints that reveal upcoming events. Furthermore, I believe a key to potentially benefiting from the Trump 2.0 driver demand requires understanding how to position against a few of his known but converging the art of the deal tendencies. And these would be 1, a little hyperbole never hurts; 2, confirm an impression they were already predisposed to believe; 3rd, never get too attached to one deal or one approach; and then 4thly, sometimes your best decisions are the ones that you don't make. Finally, it's extremely important to consider rate of speed and level of efficiency surrounding Trump 2.0 changes. Since this is a been there, done that kind of thing, Trump won't fumble through the initial phase of his term trying to reconcile his frustrations towards the differences between global business and government. Trump will have a better understanding around bottlenecks and getting around choke points, including how to flex unilateral powers. Also, given that the House and Senate are Republican majorities, at least for the next 2 years, that political trifecta usually creates efficiency and makes for stickier policy changes. But the inspiration behind my latest first principles thinking content piece, or I guess content mini-series, was a Trump 2.0 section titled Rhetoric, Foreshadowing, Action is Greater Than Embellished Negotiation Tactics that I included into many of the functional CPG brand and supply-side client presentations during the last quarter of 2024. And while each of those client presentations were packed with diverse, personalized insights, I'm confident this Trump 2.0 content mini-series filled with a refined and expanded version of my generalized base case strategies will be extremely valuable to my regular audience. So just to kind of set the stage, you can expect this Trump 2.0 content mini-series to initially include 4 loosely titled parts: regulatory, global trade, financial, and commerce. But let's get started. I figured part 2 of this Trump 2.0 content mini-series should be global trade because he made imposing tariffs central to his economic program. Trump believes that access to the American market is a privilege and that the United States has one of the most open economies in the world, but lowest average tariff rates in the world. Moreover, Trump has long been a fan of tariffs, even before his first presidential campaign, because these import taxes are a powerful, proven source of leverage. But while his general strategy of ensuring U.S. trade policy serves the national interest is commendable, it doesn't mean stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements share the same overwhelming level of optimism and excitement they've expressed surrounding Trump's health agency selections. And that's mainly because most functional CPG inputs, whether various ingredients or raw materials, are sourced from other parts of the world. Also, in many cases, industry stakeholders don't even have, for a variety of reasons, much onshoring choice, which I'll expand on later in this content. So while anxiety spikes within every business sector, when Trump wields the threat of tariffs, it's arguably the highest for supplement industry stakeholders. Additionally, supplement industry stakeholders feel an outsized level of anxiety when those tariffs are pointed at China, as that singular country provides the largest portion of inputs utilized within the manufacturing of dietary supplements. But in saying that, I don't want anyone wrongfully assuming I'm only talking about specialty or performance supplement ingredients either, because China's near supply chain monopoly includes essential inputs like basic letter vitamins as well. And you might be asking yourself, how did a bunch of seemingly intelligent industry stakeholders allow this supply chain concentration to happen? Over the last probably 3 or 4 decades, the United States has transformed into a services economy. And in the process, lower operational and labor costs overseas became a huge motivating factor for manufacturers to outsource production. Then, if you consider that almost all of the functional CPG economic activity has occurred over that same 30 to 40 year time frame, it's easy to see how supply chain concentration could happen. But before I jump into the next likely logical thought going through your head, which is around possible large-scale supply chain diversification and transformation actions, I want to spend some more time and energy on defensively and offensively strategizing around current supply chain realities, as I believe it could yield a ton of value. So recapping what I just said, with most functional CPG inputs, whether various ingredients or raw materials, coming from countries of origin outside of the United States and China having near monopolies currently on many portions of those inputs, these tariffs can materially affect 2 key elements: pricing and overall supply stability. But let's start by setting a basic analytical framework, a process I'd normally take my clients through to model out scenarios and build confidence around sequences of variables. Since we are looking at Trump 2.0 global trade policy, we'd likely be considering 1, which countries currently are or soon will be facing import tariffs; 2, what will be the size of tariffs; 3, predicted tariff size consistency; and 4, how long will the tariffs last? So to help you visualize that process more clearly, let's go through that basic analytical framework by utilizing the current up-to-date information as of recording this content. And since Trump suspended the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico for at least 1 month while those countries negotiate with the United States, China would be the only country affected by Trump 2.0 tariffs, with an additional 10% tariff on Chinese imports. In terms of predicted consistency of tariff size, I'd hate to say it's a foregone conclusion that tariffs on Chinese imports will increase sometime in the next few years, but it's much lower than a coin flip probability that the size of tariff stays consistent with China, or even less likely that the tariff percentage lowers. And then finally, I believe it's extremely likely that some level of Chinese tariffs will extend throughout the entire second Trump presidential term, if not longer. But with those assumptions carrying over into the next step, what's the various strategic moves that should be considered? Firstly, if there's an alternative source outside of China for that input, an operational buffering and supply chain diversification process should begin ASAP, qualifying those other options around comparative quality and price, but also ensuring overall supply availability levels are appropriate. Moreover, if those alternative sources are within geographical areas that could face blanketed or collective Trump 2.0 tariffs like the EU, additional analysis should be considered. Next, with the current Chinese tariff level, I'd honestly view it as somewhat of a relief compared to the rhetoric being as high as 60% tariffs previously. But since Trump put 25% tariffs on China during his first term, I'd piggyback off what I just stated earlier, that it's highly likely a greater level of tariff will be placed on that country of origin. Additionally, with so much back and forth publicly going on right now around the Trump 2.0 tariffs causing other global leaders to peacock, it's super tough to gauge appropriate level of aggressiveness around different offensive and defensive strategic moves. And that's why I said the 10% Chinese tariff level was a relief, because it leaves essentially the entire strategic optionality aperture open. So with this uncertainty around global trade relations at arguably its peak, Stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements would be best served to exercise a level of patience and explore various strategic options ahead of quickly announcing pricing actions, unless absolutely necessary for business survival purposes, at least until more confidence is established on where things will settle out. And I'm sure some of my audience would enjoy me playing the impossibly fun game of rattling off every strategic option to mitigate against tariffs, but I also want to be conscious that this already dense content is quickly turning into a yawn fest of a dissertation, and I don't want to make it even worse. So I'll talk through the most common example next, but I'm also going to kind of throw a rare right hook, as Gary Vee says, and tell you that if you are facing unique business challenges, it's probably in your best interest to reach out to me for one-on-one strategic advisory. Moreover, if you are a smaller company further downstream, like a supplement brand, that doesn't own much or any of the procurement process, you might not initially feel any of these global trade battles because of your partners having elevated trade inventories, but you will one day relatively soon, so please don't get caught taking a nap on the bench press. But speaking of inventory buffering, that had been maybe the most universal tariff mitigation effort initially leveraged by the functional CPG supply chain layers. And that's because it had an extremely easy to understand cost-benefit ratio. When the second Trump presidential inauguration date was known, and there was probably a 99.9% chance some level of tariffs would start almost immediately. But a future stock-up decision would be tougher because while I think most agree with me that higher Chinese tariffs are coming, the level and start date of increases are still unknown, thus causing a more dynamic and robust risk profile. And while my supply side audience already missed that initial stocking up option, brands should consider taking advantage of well-stocked suppliers willing to keep pricing consistent or even provide price concessions and stock up on popular finished goods SKUs with the projected highest level of tariff impact. And then before I shift into examining the potential large-scale diversification and transformation actions, I'm going to use a bit of fear tactics to hopefully bring increased importance and incite some action towards reforming the supply chain. So if we repeat the business scorecard quickly, decades of cost optimization decisions inadvertently created Chinese supplier monopolies, but now trade relations between the United States and China are breaking down. Furthermore, most large-scale supply chain diversification and transformation actions would be extremely time-intensive, difficult, and/or costly to replicate domestically, leaving stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements largely exposed to geopolitical risks involving China. And I've mentioned this in past content, maybe 2 years ago, but the supplement industry could become unrecognizably annihilated because of US trade restriction actions on China occurring from a black swan event like if China were to attack Taiwan. But even if we can agree that the previous administration was more likely to jump into foreign conflicts, can we also agree that Donald Trump's middle name seems to be unprecedented and unexpected, and other black swan events could result in similar trade restrictions with China? But maybe nutrients that aren't just functional CPG inputs, but also needed for domestic agricultural practices might be considered a matter of national security that requires government intervention to supersede any trade restrictions. Furthermore, that same argument could create a tariff carve-out with China, even without a black swan type event. Yet, I'd hate to be the business person that's comfortable betting everything that an end of the game Hail Mary will be successful when it's only the second quarter, if you get my sports analogy. All I'm saying is things can get scary fast for stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements if they don't start doing the hard work ASAP to reform the supply chain. And while I can point back to years of my documented commentary that stated the need for change, I'm arguably as complicit as the next stakeholder because most of that was talking the talk, hoping that would influence action when I should be walking the walk as a powerful change agent for large-scale supply chain diversification and transformation actions. But maybe these last handful of years were an important time for introspection within the industry, where conviction was built around next steps and current business environment provides positive cost-benefit tailwinds. So let's talk about that cost-benefit analysis, because that's what really impacts the actions required when seeking real supply chain reform anyways. And this is probably also a great time to reintroduce the connective element I mentioned at the end of the previous Trump 2.0 content miniseries part, loosely titled regulatory. And that's because the leadership changes within the Environmental Protection Agency and the US Department of Agriculture, which have been largely overlooked by industry stakeholders compared to the US Department of Health and Human Services, could have an outsized impact on the cost-benefit analysis around repatriating the functional CPG supply chain. I stated earlier that most large-scale supply chain diversification and transformation actions would be extremely time-intensive, difficult, and or costly to replicate domestically. So let's use those components that create this massive challenge as our guide for deeper analysis. And to start off with, I probably don't need to detail the time-intensive aspect, as most professionals realize that the process from planting various herbs and botanicals to harvesting time is not overnight. And that's not considering any variables beyond introduction of farming basics you learn as a child. Similarly, building production facilities or even retrofitting existing production facilities can't happen overnight. And that's not considering any variables beyond introduction to construction basics you learn as a child. And since we're talking about functional CPG products, many of which have daily purchasing frequency, these longer-term strategic decisions oftentimes get overlooked because they will never fix challenges immediately. But then considering the difficult aspect next, I could repeat that most professionals realize effectively and efficiently growing enough or making enough inputs for an emerging and intersecting functional CPG space domestically would be challenging. But let's move past the obvious and discuss, against the backdrop of the Trump 2.0 America First global trade policies, how the EPA and USDA can potentially impact decisions. As I've stated previously in this content, many ingredients and raw materials are sourced from other parts of the world, but that doesn't mean there aren't already outlier domestic suppliers. Off the top of my head, one such example would be Kiwahako, an ingredient subsidiary of Kirin Holdings that most of my audience would recognize as the maker of my favorite brain health ingredient, Cognizant. But while its facility located in Southeast Missouri doesn't manufacture Cognizant, it does produce various kinds of amino acids. So then, why don't more raw materials and ingredients get produced within the United States? Environmental issues are complex, but certainly within the purview of new EPA leadership to roll back, relax, and or remove costly elements of certain regulations that make production impossible or unprofitable. And with Lee Zeldin stating his belief that for too long, the EPA has actually stood for ending production agriculture, there's real possibility of impactful changes ahead. Similarly, why aren't more raw materials and ingredients grown within the United States? Agricultural issues are complex, but certainly within the purview of new USDA leadership, as Brooke Rollins has stated that her focus will be around eliminating burdensome and costly regulations that hamper innovation, especially around new trade products. Therefore, improved marketplace dynamics could create a more enticing opportunity for US farmers to solve all those issues that have caused growing herbs and botanicals at scale impossible or unprofitable. And finally, I'll introduce the costly aspect, but it will also be expanded upon and become the connective element for my next Trump 2.0 content miniseries part, loosely dubbed financial. So there's obviously a multitude of direct costs with any tariff mitigation strategies, as building US production involves major capital expenditures and setup around growing new products can be insanely expensive. But what about the indirect costs that can arise from other supply chain diversification strategies that you probably thought I forgot about, like friendshoring, aka moving production to allied countries, and nearshoring, aka moving production to nearby countries? While these supply chain diversification strategies can and should be also explored, there can also be hidden costs if quality diminishes or cost inflation causes intentional shortcuts, thus hurting consumer trust, which is fundamentally important for industry success long term. And piggybacking off global trade policy items you probably thought I forgot about, I wanted to quickly consider the potential impacts on US exports. As you've likely noticed lately, when Trump even includes the word tariff into a sentence that includes a foreign country name or a known major export of that foreign country, that foreign leader will quickly peacock on national media to mention retaliatory tariffs. Now, I'm less concerned with risks surrounding a complete inability to sell into lucrative markets from new export trade restrictions, but obviously tariffs usually go in both directions. And some stakeholders that are overly exposed to this trade risk should be actively assessing various hedging options. And then, as a quick final reminder, more details on extremely impactful financial instruments like interest rates or tax incentives that impact the strategic decisions of stakeholders operating within the intersecting CPG categories of functional foods, functional beverages, and nutritional supplements will be included within the next Trump 2.0 content miniseries part, loosely dubbed Financial. But I hope you enjoyed the first principles thinking that went into my latest YouTube video. If you did, can you do me a favor by hitting that like button? That quick and free action helps YouTube know my content is worth spreading to more people. Also, we're getting really close to reaching my next subscriber goal, and it would be great if you join me on this journey. But to do that, we need to fix the fact that slightly more than 3/4 of you that are watching this video right now are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, and that hurts my feelings. Regardless, I want to thank you for giving me some of your attention and time, and I'll see you on the next one.